reason to depart from it, the practice in this country is to follow that guidance. And really all of the propositions I am advancing to you are premised on that. And I don't take it that any of the acoustic experts you're hearing from have any different view, nor indeed, I think, the planners. I think where this starts to become a more interesting conversation is how do you reconcile some of that with the zoning decision that you need to make, and how do you deal with some of the circularity that seems to arise? Because if I can signal this, I am acutely aware that the proposition I'm advancing, that zoning comes first and that drives the standard, is not the complete picture. Because of course you've already been taken to the back end of the standard, where there is another layer of guidance that says once you've got to that point, you also then undertake more of a planning exercise to look at and think about things in a broader way. You do end up with a bit of circularity going on here. But the main proposition that I'm wanting to get across here is you do have both these decisions to make here, both an ICB and a zoning decision. I would say that there is a priority that is established by the phrase that I've taken you to and the diagram that I've taken you to that strongly says you need to have a zoning outcome in mind in order to properly do the first step even of setting the ICB.
Okay, thank you for that.
So I was at.
So can we dispense with the?
Yes, thank you. I won't dwell further on that, but I'm happy to answer any other questions that.
So I can see David might have his hand up, but he doesn't.
I do. I didn't put it up because mainly because no one's been looking, so I've just unmuted instead. The question I have for you, Mr. Fifield, is the diagram that was in front of us with the orange area. Is that an example of the quotation that you've produced in paragraph 15 about whichever is the greater?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Okay, so even though it's not within the predicted 65 dBA contour, it is an area for port purposes, and therefore the standard suggests it should be in the ICB.
Yes, and the way that I read that diagram is that if you were to treat the top of the figure as north, which it roughly is, given this is Nelson, then the northeastern boundary of the area I have shaded in orange, where that area adjoins other port zoned land, there is a cadastral boundary there, which is where the orange colouring stops. That's the cadastral boundary at which you would draw the inner control boundary. You would put your green line across there to the water's edge. If it weren't for the guidance saying to you, that the standard saying to you, you need to include land that is port zoned. So the reason the green line continues beyond that parcel further to the southwest before it comes back out to the water's edge is because of the guidance that I've taken you to.
Okay. And in terms of that guidance, the reference in the second line of the quotation where it talks about shown in any local authority plan as an area for port purposes, is that referring to a zone? Is that the common understanding of that phrase?
Well, I don't know that it's common, but that is definitely the submission that I am advancing to you.
Yes. And then...
And sorry.
Yes. Yes, carry on.
Well, I would say, even before you get to figure one, it's hard to construct any other meaning from those words. They are vague, I've signaled that, but I really don't think, even on a common sense reading, that one could meaningfully extract some other interpretation of those, but figure one really puts that to bed in my submission.
Yes. you then draw on that, and this is where we came to, I think, paragraph 19, where you distinguish between, well, I guess the argument from Ms. Hooper and Mr. Stiles about ownership and use on one hand and zoning on the other hand.
Yes.
So the
Yes,
fact of the matter at them.
I've got more to say on that. So
Yes,
it may be
okay.
that-
Yes, we'll carry on then.
Okay. So I'm at the top of page 6 now, and I hadn't taken you through Mr. Stiles' various passages, but I say about them, all of those lead Mr. Stiles to conclude that there is no basis in the standard for including the site inside the ICB because it is, quote, not used for port purposes. With respect to Mr. Stiles, I say that misstates the concept in the standard. Clause 631, which is the clause I replicated in my paragraph 15, does not require sites beyond the 65 decibel contour to be included because they are part of the working port or used for or associated with port activities. It unambiguously requires their inclusion if they are shown in the plan as an area for port purposes. This, I say, is a heavily loaded distinction. Mr. Stiles' approach focuses on ownership and usage, whereas the standards focus is on a land resource's potential as represented by the community's zoning choices incorporated into the plan. The language of clause 631 makes no reference to ownership or usage. I also draw attention to the final phrase from the last paragraph that I quoted above. This is from Mr. Stiles. He said, in my view, this means that the seaport site is no longer land used for or associated with port activities as defined by the New Zealand standard. And you'll recall he provided some clarification of his position to you in response to this specific matter. I had said at my paragraph 24 that I could find no definition in the standard for, quote, port activities or, quote, land used for or associated with port activities, which were his phrases. So it wasn't clear to me what Mr. Stiles means, but I now understand what he means because what he said to you was he agreed that in the passage that I have replicated from the definition of port, that the underlined words were the heart of the definition. Port means any area of land or water, whether or not it is within the coastal marine area, used, intended, or designed to be used either wholly or partly for port-related activities. And where Mr. Stiles and I differ is his interpretation of the phrase intended or designed to be used. Because what I say, and I've got this at 25, this specifically provides that a port will include areas intended or designed for port activities, even if only partially so intended or designed. Actual usage for port activities is not required, and this seems to align well with the language in clause 631, requiring the ICB to take account of an area's potential use for a port as manifested by the application of port zoning. And this might become clearer as I take you to an example from Ms. Hooper's evidence where I say the same thing is going on. Ms. Hooper's evidence adopts essentially the same approach as Mr. Stiles. She says the former justification for the extension of the boundary to the southern side of the seaport site was predicated on the basis that the land formed part of the operational port, and the standard requires the ICB to locate it at the most landward boundary of sites used for port purposes. With respect to Ms. Hooper, I reiterate that whether or not the land formed part of the operational port is not the basis on which clause 631 directed the site should be included in the port zone. Clause 631 directed its inclusion in the ICB because it was shown as an area for port purposes. At this juncture, can I take you to,
Can I, is this a question I have on your 25, Morgan?
yes,
We can't tell by exactly by the text you've used, but I think if I italicize the words intended, designed, and potential, are those, is that right? Are
they are italicized, yes,
yes, for emphasis.
correct,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
And partly as a nod to the fact that they are intended, that this is the language that is used in the quote. Yeah. This was a point at which I just wanted to respond to something that was raised in the Seaport submissions. That's not the, identify the passage. Yes, this is it. And you don't need to have this in front of you. I'll read it to you. It's at paragraph 1.13 of the primary legal submissions that were given, not the scope, not the separate scope submissions. And the sentence reads, "It is not for the port to dictate what is to take place on SLC's land by, among other things, including unsubstantiated and fanciful port activities in future noise modelling to justify the continued inclusion of the site within the inner noise control boundary." And there are a couple of things that I wanted just to comment on here because I think they relate to what I've been submitting to you thus far. The activities, I'm sure you recall, that are being described as in the submission as unsubstantiated and fanciful, the reach stacker and the container lift that are included in Mr. Fitzgerald's 2035 noise model. So I don't think there's any doubt about what we're talking about. The first point to make is that the port, and this is really just a placeholder because I'll come back to this when I discuss Mr. Fitzgerald's evidence a bit later on, but the port's resistance to sensitive residential activity on this site is not based on an assumption of those activities, the reach stacker and the container lift. It's not pinning the outcome it is asking for here on the presence of those activities or indeed any other port activities on the SLC site. So I want to make that point now, but I will come back to why that is. I think it's important that that's said in response to this passage. That the point that I wanted to make, though, more strongly for now is that first part of the sentence I read to you was, "It's not for the port to dictate what is to take place on SLC's land." And I totally agree with that. And I say it's also not for SLC to dictate it. The port, I say, is not here representing the preferences that it has as a corporate entity. It is representing the interests of the community in retaining and providing for port activities as regionally significant infrastructure. And as I go through my submission, I'll just identify one or two places where I do have disagreement with what's been put in the Seaport submissions.
Just finish writing that sentence.
So I was saying it is representing the interests of the community.
What we're just getting is regionally significant infrastructure. I'll read back what I've written down. It's not a port's position of representing the interests of the community and providing for port activities as regionally significant infrastructure.
Yes, correct. And what I'm really doing there, Mr. Chair, is I'm trying to emphasize that the debate that you are confronted with for the purposes of this hearing is actually not a debate between one private entity's preference and another private entity's preference. The port is not in front of you to say, we'd rather it was this, that, or the other. The port is here to represent what it says the port zoning itself stands for in the district plan.
You're not advancing that because the port is owned by the Taranaki Regional Council. You're advancing a community position because of that ownership, or
no, it's not. I'm not trying to emphasize the nature of the ownership. What I'm trying to emphasize is the direction that is set up by all those provisions I've taken you through in the New Zealand Standard is focused on what kinds of decisions have come out of the community planning process and are now evident in zoning. It's not guided by who owns the land just now and what do they want to do with it. Now, I say that is in many respects the position that's being advanced to you by Seaport is very much about their ownership of the land as it stands and what they would consider doing with the land. And I think the difference between us in many ways is quite a fundamental distinction that I am submitting the actual analysis required here should not be focused on the individual preferences of the present owner. This is a point that is made in Ms. Carter's evidence, for example, but should be using the kind of lens that the standard tells us to use, should be focused on a more community-oriented decision or aspiration for providing, retaining and providing for the port as regionally significant infrastructure.
okay.
So I was at paragraph 28 of the legal submissions. As addressed above, I submit that clause 631 dictates, and that's 631 of the standard, of course, dictates that in circumstances like the present, where both the zoning of the site and the location of the ICB are being determined, the zoning decision ought to be made first, as it has the potential to guide the ICB location in the manner specified in clause 631. Mr. Stiles and Ms. Hooper have not taken that approach. They have assessed the location of the ICB separately from the zoning. I submit Ms. Carter and Mr. Fitzgerald's approach is more consistent with clause 631. Their combined approach is to first settle the zoning question and then assess what impact that has on the ICB location decision. Mr. Wesney also adopts what I suggest is the correct approach, concluding that if the panel determines the site should retain its port zoning, then the current location of the ICB is most appropriate. In short, zoning first, ICB second. And for completeness, I observe that there are locations other than the Seaport site that are shown in the planning maps as port zone, but which are beyond the predicted 65 decibel contour. An example is the strip of land that runs along the landward side of the Seaport site, over which KiwiRail holds a designation. Irrespective of the outcome of Seaport's submissions, this strip of land will remain zoned for port purposes, and full implementation of clause 631 in respect of this land would include it also within the ICB. But that is not a matter for you to address, as it has not been raised in any submission or further submission. And I do need to add a rider to that, which is Ms. Hooper advanced a different view about how the rezoning of Seaport's site would play out in terms of that KiwiRail corridor. I have not had an opportunity yet to have a discussion with Ms. Hooper about that, but I mean to find out her view as soon as she's available to me. And it may be that I need to modify the submission that I've advanced at my paragraph 31 in light of that. Because Ms. Hooper, sorry, did I say Ms. Hooper? I meant Ms. Carter. I meant Ms. Carter. Sorry.
Ms. Carter. It's been a long- it's not day.
Commissioner McMahon's brain is not the only one going to mush. But Ms. Hooper was advancing the proposition that the zoning of that Kiwi Rail strip, being a railway, would take its zoning from the neighbouring land.
Okay.
And I'm conscious that that's her position, and I dare say if I need to, I can amend what I've said at paragraph 31.
After speaking with Ms. Carter, look, I think that's a good place to stop on the basis that Janice is still there, which is coming down tonight. And we do move into quite a different topic. It's been a big day, and if you're happy, we'll stop there.
Totally in your hands, Mr. Chair.
Yes, and finally get to you tomorrow. So yes, someone's put a big thumbs up. So
That's your comment.
it's an agreement. But David, thank you for that. I will adjourn till 1 o'clock in the morning, and we'll just carry on with your submission. Thank you for your attendance and your participation today, and for everyone sitting in. We'll see you tomorrow morning.